So as you turn to John 4, I add my word of greeting to those you've already heard, in Jesus' name. Very happy to be with you this morning, to worship the living God with you through singing His praises, prayer, studying His word. You know, the Christian life is really pretty simple. It's amazing how, I'm not going to say you, I'm going to say me. It's amazing how different my prayers are from apostolic prayers. My prayers are dominated by about three things: petition for protection, relief, and comfort. You never find that in the apostolic prayers. When you read apostolic prayers, they pray for opportunity, boldness, and faithfulness. And I say the Christian life is simple, but sometimes we miss the point. We don't just miss the point once. We miss it sometimes for a lifetime. I'm just preaching to myself. And I just am so grateful for Henry and Lisa and David and the catalytic partnership that they have. Almost like Priscilla and Aquila and Paul, and how they provide a platform for the three great preoccupations of the Christian life, which are prayer, witnessing, and Bible study. And the hardest of these is witnessing. So anyway, it's just great to be with you. Now, I started working at Harvest Church about 3.5 years ago, and when I was being recruited, it's funny, when they were trying to decide whether they dare hire me, the first time I talked to Bill Garner, who's a dear friend that I missed terribly, went to heaven via a plane crash in January 2023, he said, "You'll be preaching on Sunday morning about 10 times. The next time I talked to him, he said, "You'll be preaching on Sunday morning about 8 times. Next time I talked to him, he said, "You'll be preaching on Sunday morning about 6 times. I just decided I don't want to talk to him anymore. So the first couple of times David talked to me, he said, "I want you to take the whole month of June." And the last couple of times I talked to him, he said, "I want you to take 2 months in June." So I'm not going to talk to David anymore about this. But I will say this, I'm not going to rush through this story. So if we need to do once a month for 6 months, I'm not going to rush through this story. It's an overwhelming story. And I'm going to say something a little bit audacious, and we'll just get to the beginning of it today, and I'm not going to keep it that long. So I would say this, if any objective person knew enough about the relationship between the Jews and Samaritans in the first century, we wouldn't need anything beyond John 4 to have overwhelming evidence that Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God. There's no other explanation for what he did. There's a group of fools who call themselves scholars. They work on things called the Jesus Project, and they try to deconstruct the gospel in the New Testament, and they try to account for Jesus in terms of what's called Second Temple Judaism. What would a young rabbi or aspiring rabbi, why would he do what he did, and why would he think what he thought? Everything that Jesus did was just the opposite of those expectations. Everything. Much of what he did was counterintuitive to the human, not just counterintuitive to messianic expectations, but counterintuitive to the human. You know what I mean by counterintuitive? We do the opposite of what a person would do. The greatest or the most obvious example of that is when he healed the blind man. What did he do to heal the blind man? John 9. He rubbed mud in his eye. Isn't that what you would do to help somebody see? You see what I mean by counterintuitive? We could talk about the reasons why he did that. There were reasons. But when we understand what the relationship was between these two peoples, what the history was, and when we see what Jesus did, we're overwhelmed. And we really don't need any other apologetic. Of course, we have tons of apologetics. But But what I want to do is I want to back up and I want to talk about the whole biblical narrative and what Jews were taught, what they believed, what Jesus brought to this situation. When you look at the Old Testament, there's something called the wisdom books. The wisdom books are Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Job. And when you look at Job and the Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes, you actually see what man's three great preoccupations are. And the book of Job is about a man who suffered mysteriously because he was not only a good man, he was the best man. And the book takes us behind the curtain and shows us the heavenly debates and what was really going on and how Job was being tested to prove that he would worship God because he was God, not because he was Santa Claus. And yesterday on the lacrosse field at ECS, a young girl died. And that's a call we don't want to get as parents. It's really the worst thing we can imagine. And Job had lots of kids, and they all died, and they died all on the same day. So the worst thing that can happen to somebody happened to Job. And he had 4 great tragedies in his life. He lost his children, he lost his possessions, he lost his health, and he didn't lose his wife. And the devil could do anything he wanted to do except take Job's life to discourage Job. He could do anything he wanted to do. But he didn't take Job's wife away. What does that tell you? And why should he? Because she was the devil's agent in his life, urging him to curse God and die. And then you have the book of Ecclesiastes, which considers the question, what does it all mean and why does any of it matter? The book of Ecclesiastes is really a book about death. It's a book about if the philosopher and the fool are going to be thrown into the same ditch, what difference did it make after all? It's a book called Living Life Backwards by a Scotsman named David Gibson. If you can get your hands on that book, get your hands on the book. It's tremendous. And then there's a book about sex and romance, which people are obsessed with. And the irony is that Solomon wrote the book, but he never got it because he kept trying to reproduce the best feeling we ever had, the feeling when we fell in love, and then the even better feeling if we discovered that our love was reciprocated and requited. And yet some people go through life trying to recapture that feeling. When love settles down and becomes a working partnership to raise children and to honor God, they just want that initial feeling again. And so they go after it in another relationship, and it's tragic. We ask ourselves the question, what do you need to have great romance? And I would even say, I'll just say the word, even great sex. Well, it helps to be really great looking. And it helps to have a lot of money to do really fun things. If you want to attract attractive people, you be attractive yourself and provide them with great adventures. And where do we find that in great profusion? We find it in Hollywood. Great looking people getting paid millions of dollars a year to pretend that they're somebody else. But what do we also find in Hollywood? Well, we find divorce over and over and over. And even when they stay together, we find either cheating or open marriages, like Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith. And what else do we find? Well, we find drug taking. And what else do we find? We find everybody has a therapist, because everybody can afford cocaine, so they buy it and take it. They can afford a therapist, so they pay hundreds of dollars an hour to psychiatrists. What does that tell you? Well, they want the psychiatrist to explain to them why they have everything, but they're not happy. If they were happy, they'd stay with the first woman and they wouldn't take drugs, and they wouldn't need to pay somebody hundreds of dollars an hour to tell them why they're not happy. And the irony is that person doesn't know. And Solomon continued to find that relationship, even though he was an inspired writer who knew as much favor from God as any man who ever lived, except for the gift of disciplined godliness, which always escaped him. Now, this is the great wisdom of the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, we're shown a man who actually kept the law, all the law, who was perfect, and who could say, I always do the things that please my Father. Now, if you could say anything that Jesus said, what would you want to say? Well, you might want to say, little girl, arise. That'd be pretty cool to be able to say that, wouldn't it? Or to say, be healed, or stand up and walk. That'd be pretty good to say. But when you think about it, the greatest thing to say would be to say, I always do those things which please my Father. Oh my God, and I say that reverently, not profanely. Oh my God, if I could only say that, but I can't. But one man could, and it was believable. Now, that's the man who was sent to this planet a little over 2,000 years ago. I've said this before in this room, I'm going to say it again. The gospel, we talk about the biblical narratives and we say if they'd been made up, they would have been made up differently. This narrative would have been made up differently if it were made up. The fact that Mary Magdalene, a woman, had to convince the unbelieving disciples who were hiding that Jesus was risen, if the Gospels were made up, that would have never been in there because that was humiliating to the disciples. And it wasn't a great apologetic because a woman couldn't even give testimony in a court of law in the Roman Empire. So why was that reported? Because it's what happened. If the Gospels had been contrived, the cry of dereliction would not have been reported. My God, why have you forsaken me? Because on the surface, for people who don't study and don't know and don't understand, it seems like he gave up, that it was a failure. That's what Albert Schweitzer thought. He even wrote a book about it called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. So had it been made up, the disciples would not have looked so foolish and so cowardly. But I went further, and I said this once in this room, 18 months ago or something. I'll say it again. The gospel could not have been made up. It could not have been made up because you can't invent that which you cannot imagine. Now, you can do impossible things with cartoons because you can imagine those things, even though you can't do them. The gospel is unimaginable. Let me prove it. Israel, after getting out of Egypt for a time, was made captive by 5 successive world empires: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. You could throw a 6th in there if we talk about the heirs of Alexander, the Seleucids. Okay, but let's just say the big 5. Let's imagine that one of the emperors of one of those great empires called the Council of War. Let's say Nebuchadnezzar. That's a name we're pretty familiar with, the great Babylonian emperor. And let's say all those commanders came to a huge room in Babylon, and they sat down at round tables like you're sitting down, only in a much larger room. And the emperor stands and he says, "Gentlemen, there's been a rebellion in a province of our empire. Those rebels murdered our ambassador. They massacred our garrison. They put our representatives to flight, and they fortified our borders. They fortified their borders. Gentlemen, what shall we do to bring them back under our dominion?" Back of the room, somebody raised, "Stand and speak, General." The general stands up and said, "I know, sire. Let's send your only son and heir unarmed across the border into the enemy camp, where he'll be mocked, ridiculed, spit upon, tortured, and murdered. Then those rebels will know how much we love them." Now, that never happened, did it? And you'd be willing to bet $10,000 that it never happened, and you'd call it easy money, even though you don't have a degree in ancient history. How do you know it never happened? Why are you so sure it never happened? You're sure it never happened because it's not a human thought. It's not a thought that could ever originate in a human brain. But it did happen once, didn't it? But it wasn't a human thought. It was a divine thought. And it wasn't a thought that originated on this planet. It was a thought that originated in heaven. And we call that thought the gospel. And you see, we are so familiar with it, especially those of us who grew up in the South. We live in such a gospel-saturated culture, even though the gospel has been ignored by people who've heard it, that it doesn't have a jolt. It doesn't shock us because we're so familiar with it. But it's a shocking story. It's an unbelievably shocking story. As a matter of fact, it's an unbelievable story because it's not a human story. It's a divine story. And so the Son who was sent unarmed into the world is the young man in his early 30s who goes through Samaria. And it said that in John 4:3, he left Judea, he departed again into Galilee, and he must go through Samaria. It's John 4:4. Why? He just have to go through Samaria. Now, the amazing thing about that historically is that pious Jews would not set foot in Samaria. As a matter of fact, they would lengthen their journey. They would go way out of their way. If they were going south in Judea to north in Galilee, like Jesus and his disciples were traveling, they would go over to the east side of the Jordan River and travel north until they passed Samaria. And then when they pulled even with Galilee, then they crossed over to the west bank of the Jordan. But he went straight through Samaria. And when they came to this place called Sychar, where Jacob's well was, it says in verse 6, Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat on the well, and it was about noon. Now, the fact that we're told what time it is very important. I don't know if you ever read Spurgeon. I think the first 5 or 6 sermons I read by Spurgeon, if you don't know who he is, 1834, 1892, I think the greatest preacher in the history of our language. First 5 or 6 sermons I read by Spurgeon, I didn't care for them. I don't know why I kept going. I'm so glad I did. I'm sure that I've read over 500 sermons by Spurgeon, and I'm much the better because I did that. But one of the best is Spurgeon's sermon about Jesus sitting on that well, exhausted and thirsty. It's unbelievable because of all the implications about the incarnation and what it meant to become a real man in Palestine in the first century. Spurgeon is just magnificent in his treatment of that verse. And how could he be thirsty? He made everything, but it's what it means to be really human. Water plays a big role in the opening chapters of the Gospel of John. John the Baptist is baptizing in chapter 1, and Jesus turns water into wine in chapter 2, and Jesus tells Nicodemus that he's got to be born of water in chapter 3. And you got the well of Siloam in chapter 5, and you got, I think Jesus walk on the water in John 6? I think he does. In John 7, he stands along the parade route and he screams, if any man is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. It's just on and on. And but twice we're shown and that he's thirsty, here and on the cross. So he went straight through. He didn't go around. And then a woman comes up to draw from the well. Now, I'm going to disappoint you by saying this, but I'm just being honest. I don't care for the chosen. And there are lots of reasons. And I know it's meant a lot to many of you. And if it helps you, by all means, but be careful. And I'm very uncomfortable when we put words in Jesus' mouth. Very uncomfortable. Also, I don't like a portrayal of Jesus by a fallen sinner. You know, I'm going to disappoint you again. Maybe my favorite film of my lifetime was Chariots of Fire. And I knew about Eric Liddell before that film came out. And I saw the film 5 times. The man who played Eric Liddell, Ian Charlton, was gay, and he died of AIDS. And see, that's the problem. When somebody ungodly pretends to be somebody godly. But so when somebody pretends to be Jesus, there are one of 2 possibilities, okay? Either the art works. Now see, if the art works, we're in a danger zone for idolatry. Because if the art works and that actor makes me think he's Jesus, it's impossible that I would not have notions and motions of worship toward him. So if the art works, it's idolatry. If the art doesn't work, what's the point? What's the point? Okay. Now I'm leading up to something a little bit nicer, okay? I'm not going to be a spoil sport in every way, okay? Somebody sent me the clip from The Chosen on the woman at the well, and it is magnificent. I mean, it is magnificent. And it's magnificent because of the girl who played the woman. And I would encourage you to watch it. And I mean, she got it. And the people who wrote that, they got it. Now there's extra stuff that Jesus says, which is not in the Bible. It's very plausible, though. Very plausible. And again, it was dangerous because, I mean, the art didn't work. I would never think that Jonathan, what's his name, was Jesus. But I saw him play Lonnie Frisbee in that movie about the Jesus movement. So I'm never going to think that. But anyway, I would encourage you to watch that clip. It's actually quite good. Now, she approached him. She didn't think she was approaching him. She thought she was approaching water. The reason she approached him was because he approached her. He came to Samaria looking for her. He didn't go into town with the others. As a matter of fact, it's very strange that he didn't go into town because they left him there unprotected. And I'm sure in a place where people hated Jews. And I'm sure they whispered one another, should we leave him here? And somebody says, believe me, he can take care of himself, which is true, you know. But I mean, there are other strange instances like that, like Jacob sending Joseph out to look for his brothers by himself. That God had to make him do that. That was not smart. That was not wise. And I'm sure he reproached himself many times, thinking that Joseph got killed on that errand. So they leave Jesus alone because he's, not just because he's tired, but because he's looking for her. There's a passage, I think it's in the first book, I think it's in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I can't remember, but there's a passage in Narnia where a little girl is lost in the woods, and she's hoping to find Aslan, and she is crying out his name, Aslan, Aslan, Aslan. And then she sees him sitting beside a river. And he's completely calm. He's not nervous or agitated. And she runs to him and she throws her arms around his neck. If you don't know about Narnia, there's a great lion, there's a great Christ figure. Not Christ, but someone invented to remind us of Christ, named Aslan. And the child throws her arms around his neck and buries her face in this great mane and just wets that mane with her tears. And he says, "Oh, Aslan, Aslan, I was looking for you, Aslan. I was looking for you." And he said, "I know, child. You wouldn't have been looking for me if I hadn't been looking for you." So she's looking for water. He's looking for her. Now, he addresses her. And I happened to pick up the King James. I actually looked for another Bible and was late, so I'm going to read it in the King James. "There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water." I actually love that antique language. "There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said unto her, Give me to drink." For him to initiate a private conversation with her is not a done thing. And for him to continue in a conversation with her when they were alone was a scandalous thing. And what ensues, if you were taking a walk in Shelby Park or Audubon Park or Cameron Brown or any of these places around Germantown and Memphis, and you were to see me sitting on a bench, on a park bench, with a woman in my lap, and that woman was not my wife, not my daughter, not my sister, and we're not making a movie, there would be no possible good explanation. There couldn't be a good explanation. I mean, no matter what I said, no matter how I explained, it wouldn't be an acceptable explanation. Knowing what we know and believing what we believe, having the convictions that we have, that my wife is still alive, there's not a good explanation. You have to believe me when I tell you that for them later to see him talking to her alone, it was just as scandalous as that would be. Just as scandalous. And we don't talk about this at church. But when she asked the question, what are you doing as a Jewish man asking me for a drink, a Samaritan woman? What are you talking to me like that for? That was a rhetorical question. She didn't ask that question to gain information. She asked that question to let him know that I know what you're doing. I know what you're up to. Because in her thought world, she had only had one experience of men. And she knew that for a man, especially a Jewish man, to address her in such an intimate, personal way, there could be only one explanation as to what his hope and goal was in that setting. Now, again, we don't talk about that at church, but it's a fact. She thought he was trying to seduce her. And it would be, you go down to the bar at the Hilton or some other place. It used to be Houston's. We don't have Houston's anymore. And, a man who's alone, and he sits next to a woman who's alone, and what does he say? Well, if he has designs, he says, "Can I buy you a drink?" And that's the way it gets started. Well, Jesus does the opposite. He says, "Can you give me a drink?" But she still makes the same assumption. And, we as Christians, we get a lot of exhortation in this room about sharing our faith. And you get a lot of opportunity when you follow these fanatics out to Shelby Farm on Sunday afternoon. And one thing we do, and it's quite understandable, is we rack our brains to figure out what can we do for an unbeliever? How can we serve the unbeliever? Maybe we're going to give him cold water on a hot day. That's a pretty good idea. You know that often Jesus did the opposite. Jesus let the unbeliever do something for him. He did that with a Samaritan woman. He also did it with Zacchaeus at the very end of his ministry. I have a friend named David Guthrie. He's 6'3". He played college football. He lives on the North Carolina coast. I saw him 6 weeks ago. And I was his pastor for almost 8 years. And the day before I left North Carolina to move to Munich, we met for lunch at Western Sizzlin Steakhouse. And when we were walking to the car, David Guthrie had tears running down his face. And I knew he was crying because I was leaving. I knew that was the reason he was crying, but I wanted to hear him say it. And I said, David, why are you crying? You know what? He didn't say what I thought he was going to say. As a matter of fact, he said something that cut me to the quick. He said, I'm crying because I've known you for 8 years, and this is the first time you've ever let me pay for lunch. Now, what was he saying? Why was he emotional? What he was saying was, for the first time, finally, on our last time together, you recognize that maybe I have something to offer you. That was worth about 5 years of sermons for me to have that experience. Jesus asked her for something. And she wants to know why he's talking to her. Now, I told you that if we knew enough, or if an inquirer knew enough about the history between the Jews and the Samaritans in that generation, what happens here would be enough to make them know. They might not convert. There are a lot of people who knew that Jesus was the Son of God who didn't worship him and who didn't repent. But they would have more than enough evidence that he has to be the Son of God because there's no other explanation. What happened was there were two great deportations in Israel's history in the Old Testament era. One was in 722 BC when the Assyrians hauled off the northern 10 tribes and they left Judah and Benjamin. And then in 586 BC when the Babylonians finished the job. Now, during those years before the Jews came streaming back, among the Jews who were left, there was a good deal of intermarriage with Gentiles. And if you were going to be married, it was almost necessary because most of the Jews had been hauled off. And there was a very high degree of intermarriage in that region between Judea and Galilee called Samaria. So much so that the rabbis in Jerusalem concluded that those people are not real Jews anymore. They are too ethically mixed. Now, I'm going to say something. I'm not going to say his name because you'll all believe him and not me. But one of our most revered Bible teachers has declared that this is not a chapter about racism. And that's true. That's not the point. That's not the main thing that's being aimed at. But the implications touching upon the subject of racism are overwhelming. They're overwhelming. And let me tell you something. For a Jew to learn about this in the first century, it would be all about race. That'd be the only thing they'd think about. They wouldn't think about anything else. Because these people hated each other. I mean, they loathed each other. Now, I'm going to share something with you that you're probably not going to believe. I lived in Israel I shouldn't say I lived because it was only for a summer. I stayed in Israel for the summer of 1976. I was there during the raid on Entebbe, which was the bicentennial 4th of July. It's horrible to live through ancient history because kids today they don't know what happened in recent history. And I was in Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. I work with a lot of people who have no idea what the Berlin Wall was. As a matter of fact, I talked to a 28-year-old yesterday who didn't know who Ringo Starr was. He told me his baby was due on July 7th. I'm embarrassed to admit to you that I knew that was Ringo Starr's birthday. Well, I didn't impress him because he had no idea who Ringo Starr was. I mean, that's how long ago some of us lived, Unbelievable to me. When I was in Israel, working on the oldest kibbutz in Israel, kibbutz Dagania Aleph, where Moshe Dayan was born. I was shown, it was Israeli propaganda, but it was true. And what they had was they had printed out in English quotes from Arab textbooks, Egyptian, Lebanese, and Syrian. And the hatred was so bad. Again, you're not going to believe this. You're not going to believe this. But it was not only saturated in the history text, the social studies text, the political science text. It was in the math text. And they were teaching elementary students. Now, if you have 25 Jews and you kill 12 of them, how many will that leave that you're just going to have to kill later? So help me. So help me. Now, again, you're probably thinking, I don't believe that. Well, I don't blame you. I didn't believe it either. But there it was. And they cited the sources. The institutionalization of hatred deeply embedded in the culture. It's unimaginable. Well, you know what? It wasn't a lot different between the Jews and the Samaritans. And this is an area that Jesus never backed down and never backed down. You know, in 1 Corinthians, as believers, we're given instructions about being careful about people of weak faith, and maybe we restrict our liberty to save their conscience but it says so they won't stumble. It doesn't say so they won't grumble. It says so they won't stumble. Well, let me tell you something. Jesus was flagrant in his love of all people. He was flagrant. He couldn't care less about their racial prejudice. He was in their face and you know, there was one group of people that the Jews hated worse than the Samaritans. It was the tax collectors. A Samaritan couldn't help it that he was a Samaritan. That didn't keep the Jews from hating him. The Samaritan couldn't help it. But you know what? A tax collector could help it. A tax collector, you know, I wasn't willfully born Caucasian. You weren't willfully, Steve wasn't willfully born Jewish. Antoine was not willfully born African American. But the Samaritans didn't will to be born Samaritans. But the tax collectors, they willfully betrayed their country for money to work for Rome. They were low. They were despised. So what does Jesus do in Matthew 8? He calls the tax collector to be his disciple, to come live with him. He not only goes to their parties and their receptions, tax collectors were like buzzards. You know, no animal will eat a buzzard, but a buzzard will eat any animal. Well, nobody would go to a tax collector's party, reception, birthday, wedding, except for another tax collector. And Jesus. And Jesus of Nazareth. Can't make it up. You wouldn't make it up. You wouldn't make it up because it wouldn't be helpful. You don't help convert the Jews by sharing stuff like that. Why did they share it? Because it happened. Because that's what he did. They were just writing down what he did. And then that was at the beginning of his ministry. Then near the end of his ministry, Luke 19, he's on his way to Jerusalem. And he stops in Jericho. And he doesn't do anything in private. He doesn't do it secretly. Everybody in town watching him, he calls out to a man in the tree, the most hated man in town. That's where he went to take his lunch break. And you know what? The implication was he's also asking Zacchaeus to do something for him. Go to your house. Let's have lunch. By the way, you buy. Unbelievable. But he's not backing down. He's loving Gentiles. He's loving Samaritans. And he doesn't hide it. He doesn't hide it at all. You know why? Because he's the Son of God. Because he's not from around here. Everybody from around here is prejudiced. He's not from around here. He's from heaven. No prejudice in heaven. And he exhibits this heavenly character. Everything he says, everything he does, and everything he doesn't do. Everything he refuses to do. And she says, what are you doing? What are you doing talking to me like that? How can a Jewish man like you ask a Samaritan woman for water? For the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. See, I just tried to explain what she just summed up, okay? And by the way, this didn't help. In 110, 111 BC, a man called, I didn't finish the story about the Babylonians and Samaritans and the Babylonians, Assyrians, and coming back. So what happened was after the rabbis excluded the Samaritans from temple worship in Jerusalem, the Samaritans evolved their own cult of worship. They just recognized Torah as authoritative. There are three divisions of the Old Testament, the Torah, the law, the Navaim, the prophets, the Ketuvim, the writings, and they just settled on the Torah. No, Jerusalem doesn't figure prominently in the Torah, although Melchizedek was the king of Salem, which we believe was Jerusalem. And they built their own temple. And they had their own alternate worship around Mount Gerizim. Well, in the years 110 to 111 BC, a Jewish leader, high priest, there are inscriptions on coins that talk about Yohanan Gadol Kohen, Jonathan the high priest. John Hyrcanus went up to this neighborhood in Sychar and Shechem and reduced the cities to villages and burned down the Samaritan temple. So they said, not only can you not worship in our temple, you can't worship in your temple. And this was the neighborly relations that they had, and it's behind the question she asked him about the controversy about where we can worship later on. We're not going to get to that today. We're almost done. So she thinks she knows all about him. He's a man. Men want one thing, especially a man who would begin this gambit by asking me for something to drink. Now remember, the Jews didn't go through Samaria because if the shadow of a Samaritan fell upon an observant Jew, they were considered ritually unclean. They had to go take a bath. So what does he say to her? Will you give me a drink out of your cup? I know it wasn't a cup, it was something bigger, but for poetic license. Would you give me a drink out of your cup? Can I put my mouth where you put your mouth? And that's where he starts the conversation. What are you doing talking to me like that? Jews don't talk to Samaritans. You know that. You doing talking to me like that, man? So she thinks she knows. So here's what Jesus says. He says, if you knew, if you actually did know, you know, one thing we learn when we witness is be nice, be nice. That's harder for some of us than others. It's hard for me. And especially when I hear some sophomore say, well, I already tried Jesus. I already tried Christianity. I just want to slap him. And you know, even if I were stupid enough or carnal enough to slap him, I've been taking blood thinners for about 7 years, and I know that if somebody just punches me, I'm probably going to bleed to death. So now I'm a pacifist, okay? But I'm not a pacifist in my mind. In my mind, I want to slap people or break their nose, you know, because I'm not fully sanctified. But when somebody says, I've already tried Jesus, I just want to slap them. So I thought, oh, really? So you've seen all there is to see in Jesus? What's your GPA, 2.2? You've seen everything there is to see in the infinite Son of God? That's what you're telling me? And there's nothing there of interest? You young fool. You haven't tried Christianity. You don't even know what Christianity is. So she thinks she knows all about him. She's met his type before. She's had some experience of men. She's not inexperienced with men. She knows what men are, and she knows two things. She knows three things. She knows he's a man, she knows he's a Jew, and she knows he's talking to me real personal. He's talking to me real personal. So what Jesus says, reading her mind, he says, if you did know anything about me, if you knew who I am, you'd be asking me for water. If you knew who it was who said to you, give me to drink, and if you knew the gift of God. Now I'm going to make this my last point, okay? So there are lots of ways to witness. Henry teaches the three circles. I taught Evangelism Explosion for 20 semesters for over 10 years until I realized that it's really a little bit off. It takes me a long time to see the obvious. The Evangelism Explosion presentation does a good job of summing up after the person prays, but all through the presentation is trying to get you to believe the doctrine of justification by faith, as if believing the doctrine of justification by faith will save you. Now, justification by faith is true. That's the way we get saved. But it's not actually asking you, pleading with you to believe in Jesus, his blood, his sacrifice on the cross. It's believe that heaven is a free gift. Well, we do need to believe that, but that's not the central focus of the gospel. So, praise God for James Kennedy. He had people out there witnessing. If you knew the gift of God. So Spurgeon taught me a Latin phrase many, many years ago. Many of you will know the phrase sine qua non. And what it means is without which nothing. And Spurgeon talked in one of his sermons about the sine qua non of the gospel. Well, what did that mean? It meant, well, what's the linchpin what's the supporting wall that if you take that out, the whole thing, the house crashes down? What is it that you cannot leave out from the gospel and it still be the gospel? Spurgeon said it was the doctrine of the substitutionary atonement. If we don't get it across that Jesus took our sins on his body and he died as our substitute and our sin bearer, we haven't preached the gospel. Amen. Well, so we can start this process. I mean, the hardest thing is breaking the ice and getting the thing started, isn't it? Once we get the thing started, the reflexes and the impulses of the Christian life kick in, and we start talking about Jesus, and everything's fine. It's just getting up the gumption to knock on that door or walk up to that stranger and getting the thing started. And you can get it started by asking lots of questions. I've lived overseas almost 25 years. I always got it started with the same initial question: do you speak English? Now, you may have to do that. You may have to do that at Shelby Farms, okay? Yeah. But most places around here, you don't have to do that. Well, I had to do. I'm so poor linguistically that I had to get things started that way. Well, Jesus says, if you knew the gift of God, well, one thing that you have to do, and there's so many variations. You can do the EE presentation. Have you ever heard of the 4 spiritual laws? You can do the 4 law booklet. You can do the Navigator Bridge illustration. You can do the Billy Graham Peace with God leaflet. You can do Campus Crusade had an evangelistic booklet that I thought was terrible because it was so focused on self, how to have a happy and meaningful life. I mean, good grief. Some Christians are tortured to death. We don't need to make promises we can't keep. That's not the best motivation. But one thing you've got to do, one thing we have to do is to make them know that it's a gift. It's a gift to be received, not a reward to be earned. It's got to be a gift because, I work with students overseas, and these students, many of them were not allowed to go to university if they were Christians. And they were brainwashed by communist governments to think that smart people don't believe in God. Only old women and fools believe in God. And I would be challenged quite often, hundreds of questions, maybe thousands of questions over 25 years. But it was really the same 3 or 4 questions asked hundreds of times. 95% of the time I was asked 1 of 4 questions. How could the Bible and science be true? How could there be so much suffering and God be a good God? If there's only one true religion, why are there so many religions? I really liked that one because that was the easiest one to answer. Because the answer to that is there are only 2 religions. There's true religion and false religion. There's the religion of God and the religion of the devil. There's the religion from heaven, the religion from hell. I know we as evangelicals don't like to use the word religion, but it is a biblical word. You find it in James, so it's okay. It's not a swear word. And false religion takes thousands of names. True religion takes one name. And false religion generically can be described in the phrase, that theologians use this phrase, works righteousness. And basically what works righteousness means, and all the religions of the world teach that except for one, is that we are made right with God by something we do for God. We are made right with God by a gift we bring to God, an offering we make for God. All the religions of the world teach that except for one. Now they take thousands of names, but it's the same theological system, works religion. There's only one religion that teaches that we are made right with God by something God does for us, by an offering he makes for us, by a gift he brings to us. And what Jesus says to her is, if you knew the gift of God, and if you knew who I was, you would ask me for that gift. Amen. So what's our job? It's our job to tell them who Jesus is. Because when they know who he is, they'll ask him for that gift. Okay, I think I went a little bit over time, but remember, only the promises of the Bible are true. Okay, thanks.
This is a Valley of the Well production.